Okay, welcome back to our second lecture of the Ancient Near East. So let's review some aspects of ancient Sumerian art, the beginning of it all. We talked about how the ziggurat was essentially a platform for these temples initially. They were centrally placed in the middle of the city. This was done to emphasize, of course, the importance of religion, but also visual reminder of those who were in charge, which initially was this select priest class. Only they were allowed to enter the temple, to commune with the gods, and consider the importance of that, how not every commoner or every person was able to interact with the patron deity. So only those who could interact with them were extremely important. Then we start to see this shift into the concept of priest king, where this one member of this group of priests would take charge or take control in this leadership position, taking care of the livestock, going hunting, the political and spiritual responsibilities of the city. And we talked about some of the stylistic characteristics of the Sumerians and how they're depicted. So let's look at this central image of the cylinder seal, where we see the priest king, and where he's feeding the livestock with the agriculture that they've grown, re-emphasizing part of his role of taking care of the people. We see hierarchy of scale, where he is much bigger than his attendant behind him. His skirt is much more elaborate. We have the cap or fillet on his head with his hair in a bun at the nape of his neck. And there's a great emphasis on the eyes, which we also saw with the votive statues. Now, if you haven't yet, then today at some point you need to go back through that votive figurine article that was assigned with the Near East resources, and I want you to take extremely detailed notes now that we've studied that artwork, and for you to better understand that, because it will always be an exam question. I love those. Then we see this shift into the concept of Lugal, a big man. The word choice indicates how his role is more important. The fact that we have victory steles that record these Lugal's names is important. And visually, we see his importance. He is much larger than his soldiers here in our fragment of the Stele of Eonatum's victory. So we have hierarchy of scale. His shoulders become much broader. We see the political military aspect of the king becoming more important than just feeding the livestock and taking care of the agriculture. Of course, there's still a very strong religious component. Political and religious life are not separate whatsoever. They're two in the same. So part of his role, of course, is still a priest, but he's a much more dominating force at this point. We know about all of these concepts and the Lugal individuals because the cuneiform texts that describe their victories, that describe their reign, etc. So this reemphasizes the importance of these individuals now. Then we were talking about the standard of and how visually, again, the emphasis on who's important is being demonstrated with our hierarchy of scale. And so much so, on the battle side, we see that the Lugal is so large that he extends in front of and beyond the top register. He is centrally placed, he's lighter than the other ones, so color is used, scale is used, composition is used to emphasize who is important. We also see other aspects of power demonstrated, perhaps at the what could be arguably the officers of his army that are in these leopard skin cloaks. Domestic versus wild continues to come through, where they've conquered the wild, the most ferocious animal, to prove their power and their importance. We have these elaborate designed chariots. The victors look, they're standing upright and they look larger than, of course, our losers of the war, those who they conquered. So they're going to be depicted nude in contorted images, such as those who are being trampled on by the horses in the chariots. Oftentimes their hands are bound as they're being brought to the Lugal. And this is going to become a marker of those who were defeated for centuries and across many different cultures as a visual indicator of who lost and to emphasize who was victorious. Now remember, all of these are also images of propaganda. The enemy was not running in the battlefield nude, but they're depicted so to really emphasize the importance of the victors, of the Sumerian victors. On the other side of the standard of Ur, we have the banquet scene, which we see at the top. There's the important individuals, hierarchy of scale, helps to indicate their status. The Lugal has a much more elaborate skirt. His head again extends beyond the top register. The servants and the musicians are much smaller. And the important individuals are holding these cups. So again, we assume it's a banquet scene at the top. In our second register, livestock is being brought to the Lugal, and the agriculture from the conquered city is being brought from the Lugal on the bottom register. So these civilizations are becoming much more dominant in terms of warfare. Now, some of our key periods that we're going to study, we come back to too far. We discuss Sumerian art. Today we're going to go through Akkadian, Neo-Sumerian, and Babylonian. And you'll learn some background information over the Assyrian and Persians before we have our last lecture. So here we have the Akkadian Empire. What's really important now is our modern day, when you think of a king, you probably think of an individual with absolute power. Here, under the Akkadian Empire, is where that concept is created. Remember, this is brand new. The cities are brand new. Trial and error of leadership is brand new. This is the beginning of it all. So they're figuring out as they go along. And here we have this shift to the concept of king as we know it. Remember how I talked about with the ziggurat and the temples? They were centrally placed in the city. Now we're going to see the palaces centrally placed. So everything is built around the palace. Consider how that shift demonstrates the power of the king. Everywhere you look, you're reminded of his power. He's still in charge, an important figure with the priests and with religion, but we're in a much more politically military dominating reign of these kings. They're conquering other city-states, and so we also see the idea of empire coming about, where they're taking many of these other city-states under their control. So here's the Akkad Empire. We're going to begin with this head of an Akkadian ruler. I'm going to introduce a few new art history terms. So this is believed to be a depiction of Sargon the Great. He was the first great ruler of the Akkadian Empire. I should say really the first king in terms of how what we consider a king of absolute power. Notice the shift in style. So the Sumerians were primarily depicted, think of our standard of Ur, clean shaven, bald, emphasis on the eyes, still extremely stylized and extremely realistic. Where here we have an extremely realistic individual. However, new term, he's also idealized. So he's shown, look how symmetrical his face is. Idealized, he's this ideal version of the king. Which again, consider that as a form of propaganda. If you're going to create an image of a ruler, you want to create almost a perfect one. Look at the details on his cap, the incised lines of the details of his hair. We have these furrowed brows, likely to demonstrate his great thought and consideration in his rulership and his empire. His eyebrows are still somewhat stylized, so consider that your eyes are our eyes as the viewer are drawn to this area. He has a realistic nose, realistic lips. The beard is a little more stylized. And so here we see a shift where again, he has a beard, he has hair. The medium of bronze allows for these details because once you create this bronze, hollowed out bronze, then the artisan can incise these lines in it. Let's talk about iconoclasm. So this is the destruction of images. Now, once you go back through that reading of the votive figurines, I really want to emphasize how much imagery has agency, that art affects the viewers, that these artifacts, that these sculptures, etc., had much greater purpose than just aesthetic artworks. We saw the emphasis on the eyes with the Sumerians, and so that's going to continue for much of time across the globe. It's this aspect of the soul, in other words, that it's through the eyes that we see a part of this person, part of their soul, their essence. The destruction of Sargon's eyes is reflective of this destruction of the Akkadian Empire, the destruction of the culture, of the ideas of this empire. Because initially, this likely would have had precious stones as inlaid eyes, like lapis lazuli, that blue for the pupils, or other stones. And so one of the initial thoughts may be, oh, well, they were just trying to, this next conquering nation was just trying to steal the precious materials. But really pay attention and look at how many times they stabbed the eyes with this blunt instrument. That wasn't just that they were trying to gauge out the eye to get this precious material. There was a real brutal attempt at destroying the eye sockets around this, on this sculpture. So that repeated, very blunt force re-emphasizes this idea of iconoclasm, that by destroying the image, you destroy the culture, you destroy the people, and this really marks your place as the new power. And we see this, we're going to study this in ancient Egypt, we're going to study this, and even in the present it happens in different parts of the world. We see it in other aspects of the art, such as this relief where the eyes have purposefully been destroyed. So again, I want to use this to re-emphasize the power of images and how they have agency. This was also buried right after this destruction, so that's interesting because they chose not to destroy the image as a whole. Instead, it was destroy the eyes, to destroy the soul, the essence of this empire, and then bury it. So there's something symbolic there and important. Here we have a profile view where we're back to that bun at the nape of the neck that we saw, such as the priest king on our cylinder seal. Look how extremely realistic he looks. This is a portrait of an individual, especially with the details around the nose. Okay, so continuing on, here is the victory stele of Naram-Sin. So he was the grandson of Sargon. You can imagine that he is trying to continue this powerful, dominating idea of the king. And we have elements that we're used to. We have our hierarchy of scale, clearly. He is much larger than those other individuals, including his own soldiers. And we have arguably an attempt at registers, but notice how these registers are less defined and they're wavy. That's purposeful. And we have many new aspects of formal elements. So this is a depiction of Naram-Sin victoriously conquering this group of people in a mountain range near the mountains. So hence why our registers are somewhat wavy, and how we see on the far or upper right section that mountain has cuneiform, but the shape on which it is carved into is a mountain. And so part of the reason why these registers are wavy and to show the aspect of the mountain is to further demonstrate their powers, that they were able to conquer these people in this rough terrain. It was difficult to do, versus where most of Mesopotamia is extremely flat, consider it like a fertile plain. So let's talk about new aspects. Naram is much larger, and his body is arguably extremely realistic. We see much more defined muscles here. So consider how that emphasizes and reiterates the power of this individual, the physical power of him. These artisans chose to define the muscles, look at the calves and the shoulders and his forearm muscle, etc. And so we're showing the power of this individual, his physical power. We also have this new image of this horned helmet. So hopefully you remember even from the prehistoric era that horns are important, that they represent power. And so he's pulling from that. But note that the horned helmet is associated with the king. We're going to see versions of a horned headdress that are associated with the gods. However, his choice of this horned helmet is also important. Before I go into that, if you look at the very top of this victory stele, we see these two sun discs. So those two sun discs are representative of the god Shamash, who has now come to importance under this empire. Naram Sin is closest to Shamash. He's wearing this large horned helmet, and at this point he considers himself a deity. So now we've gone from our in-priest king to our Lugal big man to our absolute power ruler king, but also in this regard he has been deified. So he's not just a priest interacting with the divine, he is now the divine. He is a deity. He is a god. So consider that aspect in itself as re-emphasizing the power of the king, of this individual. Let's analyze some other aspects of this victory stele. So of course the text provides information about it. Again, all of this is propagandistic in essence, to where it's over exaggerating their victory. And this can be seen by comparing the victors to the conquered. We see these nude figures again. They may have some articles of clothing, but they're primarily nude. And especially the figure in this very contorted pose in front of Naram Sin re-emphasizes the wild aspect of this figure. We're going to see very, again, contorted poses of the defeated to show how they're wild, rather than consider the regal and controlled pose of Naram Sin. And then right below him, his soldiers, the position of the arms, the stance, how he's standing upright and tall, versus these wild, contorted enemies falling off the mountain and being defeated. All of which is emphasizing the importance of Naram Sin and his army under the Akkadian Empire. The medium is pink sandstone, which is also important because that pink stands out. Victory steles would have been placed at high traffic areas in the cities and across the empire to again re-emphasize the importance of the ruler. Here's a close-up. I should note this victory stele was also over 6 feet tall, towered over the individual as they looked at it. It's a low relief. Okay, so Akkadian art. Let's move into our Neo-Sumerian art. We've already talked about Sumerian art. This is a new version. So here we have Gudea seated, holding the plan of a temple, the image on the left. The image on the right is a different version of this statue. We found about 26 thus far, but I just wanted to show what his head would have looked like had it still been attached. This is a leader. This is Gudea. This is the king of this Neo-Sumerian culture. This looks extremely different than our Sim, but there are aspects of it that also look familiar because it's called Neo-Sumerian. So this indicates the style that is similar to our Sumerian art. So let's consider the people who are being conquered by this ruler. They've just gone through this obviously aggressive, dominating rulership of Naram and the other Akkadians. And so when a new power comes in and they come in to conquer, in order to placate or calm the people, one way of doing so is to create new imagery. However, in this case, we're taking imagery and iconography that is familiar, that indicates a more peaceful reign, and we're adding a little twist to it to make it his own. So Gudea has elements of Sumerian art. So look at how we're clean shaven. That's extremely different than such as our Sargon ruler. There's emphasis on the eyes again and the essence of the soul. We have a much plainer cap compared to our horned helmet. And if we look at the position of the arms and the torso, it's extremely similar to our votive figurines. The arms are clasped. In other versions of the statue, he's sometimes holding an offering. But again, this clasped arms is reminiscent of those Sumerian artworks that we looked at. And so this is a much more humble king that we're seeing. And in fact, in this regard, he's humbling himself before the gods. He's sitting before the gods. Before I go into that, let's continue to analyze the figure style. Notice how he is squatter. His proportions are a little bit shorter, so he's not as dominating as our Akkadian rulers. But his muscles, his arm muscles, are more defined and more realistic looking compared to our earlier Sumerian art. So again, we're having familiar elements being used to emphasize this more peaceful reign, but a little bit of a different take on it with still a reminder of the power of this rulership of Gudea. He's also seated, which we haven't seen. He's sitting on this somewhat elaborate throne, and of course his skirt and the throne is covered in cuneiform. And this cuneiform describes a dream that he had, where he was told by the gods that he must build temples for his empire. And so the temple of the plan is in his lap, okay, where he is presenting it to the gods, where this is his plan. And consider how that shows how he is garnering favor with the gods, that the people can be assured that he speaks to the gods, that he is building for the gods, and therefore blessings will come back on the people. He also, interestingly enough, this cuneiform is an earlier type of cuneiform. So a comparison is if I were to write something in like very old English, that extremely curvy type of lettering, it gives a different feel to whatever I'm trying to say. And so in this regard, he's doing something similar where he's using this earlier version of cuneiform. And so again, harking back on old familiar ideas. Diorite is the material, the medium. It was imported. So number one, it was a valuable type of stone. We have many sculptures carved out of this of our king. And it's valuable. It's extremely difficult to carve into, hence why people often point out how the feet look a little bit odd and the hands look a little bit odd. It's difficult to carve into. We aren't seeing any gaps between his torso and his arms because you wouldn't be able to get through there or it would fall apart because of the weight of this stone. But it also is meant to last the test of time. This diorite is difficult to carve, but it's going to last a long time. So think of how that was purposeful as well to emphasize that his rule will last a long time. So here's another version where he's standing with this offering for the gods. So we're re-emphasizing the relationship with the gods rather than just this physical dominating ruler. Now let's move into Babylon, which is likely the first empire that you've heard of, which attests to its importance. Now, if you've ever heard the phrase an eye for an eye, here's where it comes from, the Code of Hammurabi. So this is a stele. It would have been one of many. It was actually, the text is missing. It was found in Susa, modern day Iran, because later on, by later people, they'd conquered the Babylonians and they took many of these objects back to Iran. It was a form of control to emphasize their power. So this is one of the few that we have left, luckily. So the Code of Hammurabi. There's cuneiform that wraps around the entirety of this stele, and it is the first written law code in history. Okay, the Code of Hammurabi. So it's the first law code, which is extremely important. First one in all of human history. This is so common to us that it's hard for us to wrap around our heads around the importance of this being the first. And so we have 282 rules carved into it. Now what's interesting is that they're extremely specific. So much so that they read like court transcripts, essentially, where it describes the crime that a person is convicted of and their sentence. And these were extremely strict sentences. I mean, this is where your eye for an eye comes from on this actual Hammurabi stele. So now the origin of that. It also indicates, or it tells us a lot about the social hierarchy. A slave would have a much harsher sentence, pretty much death for any type of transgression, versus someone in an upper class may need to pay a fine. And so it tells us a lot about the social hierarchy of this time period. So Hammurabi establishes Babylonia as a political state. He's a lawgiver. He really basically made these institutions, these customs, these laws as concrete. And he placed these across his empire in these crowded areas. So where there was a lot of traffic going on, he would place them around there as reminders of punishments, essentially. So again, these laws almost read like cases that were heard. The decision of judges are stated on them, etc. Okay, so let's talk about the imagery on top. So remember, we're coming out of, consider Gudea versus Naram-Sin. Figure on the left arguably looks more like Gudea. Of course, he has a beard. So we have this mix of different iconography of a king, of a ruler. So we have this cap rather than any type of elaborate headdress. We have a beard, which indicates importance in rulership. And this is actually Hammurabi. Across from him, seated, is Shamash. So we had just discussed him in the form of a sun disk, but now he is seen seated, and he has this horned headdress. We're going to see this type of horned headdress play out for a few different empires. Again, the emphasis of the horns as power. And now it's reserved for gods, for deities. Let's talk about hierarchy of scale. If the god Shamash were to stand up, he would be much larger than Hammurabi. So he's important in that regard. He's also seated. We're going to see for a few civilizations where only the rulers are shown seated. Everyone else would be standing, or the most important figure in this regard, this deity versus Hammurabi. But notice how he is, his feet are elevated off the ground. That will be another visual element that we'll see to emphasize the importance of someone across time with many cultures. We'll see that play out with our next unit of the Egyptians. Some argue that the pedestal his feet are on mimics mountains. Consider how for many cultures the gods reside up in the sky or above particular mountains of a region. Now let's move back up to his outstretched arm, where he is handing Hammurabi these tools that are used for architecture to create buildings. And so he is in essence handing him the tools to create civilization. He's placing him in charge. So Shamash himself is giving rulership and leadership and the tools of civilization to Hammurabi. So this emphasizes Hammurabi's importance and his power, essentially. Okay, and so that wraps up for today.